What does it mean to say that Australia is a settler-colonial society? What impact does the presence of Indigenous as well as non-Indigenous Australians have on the character of social order and social integration in Australia? In this lecture, I'll try to throw some light on these questions as a way of expanding on the way we think about national identity. I'll do that by looking briefly at the history of official policies towards Australian Aborigines since the colonisation of the continent by European settlers. Settler-colonial societies like Australia have a very distinctive foundation as nation states. They both have to come to a particular kind of ongoing relationship with their Indigenous populations, and they are also constituted from their origins as made up of migrants. The coexistence of these two characteristics of settler-colonial countries produces specific effects in the policy and practice of social integration, which can be helpful in understanding what's distinctive about their configuration of national identity. In the Australian setting, there are two distinct but interrelated narratives about social integration. First, that of the Aboriginal population and the question of their assimilation or integration into white Australian society. Second, that of successive waves of different types of migrants to Australia and the tension between assimilation and multiculturalism. Here I'll be talking only about the first, and I'll have to leave open the question of its interrelationship with the second. In relation to the Aboriginal population, the key models of integration have been assimilation, integration, and self-determination. An important determinant of the model in effect is the dominant conception of the relationship between individual and collective rights. Approaches are divided between a confinement of the concept of citizenship to one of purely individual rights on the one hand, and a sense that individual rights can only be properly realised in the context of a recognition of collective rights on the other hand. The original ambition of the British administrators of the colony of New South Wales was to somehow absorb the Aboriginal population into white society. They relied heavily on the mechanism of converting them to Christianity. However, by the late 19th century, this optimistic understanding of how Aborigines could be integrated was accompanied by a more pessimistic conception of the future of the Aborigines in Australia as being a dying race. The primary focus of organised attention to them as a population group became to protect them in the period of their final decline, to smooth the dying man's pillow. However, as Australian settler-colonialism advanced across the continent over the course of the 19th century, appropriating more and more land, Europeans came into increasing proximity to those Indigenous people they did not simply kill. With proximity comes intimacy, and with intimacy comes sex and babies. The effect of this sexual contact between Indigenous women and non-Indigenous men was to radically transform the nature of the relationship between colonisers and colonised. The European smugness about the inevitable disappearance of the Aboriginal race turned out to be a little premature. State administrators became increasingly anxious about the menacing half-caste problem, the growing numbers of the piebald specimens we meet roaming about the country at present. They became interested in the question of biopolitics, how biological tendencies could be managed and controlled. The solution to this problem was formulated as the removal of Aboriginal children into institutional or foster care. This was the basis of what has come to be known as the stolen generations since the 1997 Harry-Ock Bring Them Home report. There were two forces driving the policy of Aboriginal child removal. On the one hand, there was the presumption that whatever constituted a specifically Aboriginal cultural identity was doomed to extinction. Indeed, it deserved no better fate. On the other hand, there was the threatening image of the half-caste as a representative of a dangerous and disgusting racial hybridity. The presence of children with European features among Aborigines provided a clear focus for this revulsion. It also provided an avenue of action to rescue the civilisation which these children bore in their physical features from descent into barbarism and moral depravity. For all the Aboriginal protectors, missionaries, police and patrol officers, it was self-evident that white-skinned, blue-eyed, blonde or red-haired part Aboriginal children were automatically to be removed from life among Aboriginals. It was, wrote one patrol officer, repugnant to see an almost white child living among the Aboriginals, and this was reason enough to remove the child. Overall, there was an ongoing tension between assimilation, the pursuit of a homogenous Australian society in which everyone lived the same way, and integration, a looser conception of what held Australians together as an umbrella for a variety of cultural orientations. This conceptual opposition between assimilation and integration is best captured in the difference of opinion between the politician and administrator Paul Hasluck and the University of Sydney anthropologist A.P. Elkin. Hasluck's model of integration was the transformation of Aborigines into replicas of white Australians. He told the 1961 Native Welfare Conference that the policy of assimilation means that all Aborigines and part Aborigines are expected eventually to attain the same manner of living as other Australians and to live as members of a single Australian community, enjoying the same rights and privileges, accepting the same responsibilities, observing the same customs and influenced by the same beliefs, hopes and loyalties as other Australians. He thought that the loss of any valid and distinctive Aboriginal culture is certain in the course of time. I look to a future when a person whose great-grandfather was an Australian Aboriginal will be as proud of the fact as a Scot is rightly proud of his barbaric ancestry. He dismissed the argument for a distinctive cultural identity as mere romanticism. He mocked the idea by comparing it to the Moomba Festival in Melbourne, in the vogue of the Central Australian paintings and in the sale of factory-made koala bears and boomerangs. In contrast, the leading theorist of assimilation as integration was A.P. Elkin, Professor of Anthropology at the University of Sydney between 1934 and 1951. He argued that assimilation does not mean or necessarily involve the extinction of the Aboriginal race, that is, swallowed by social processes and intermarriage. He denied that Aborigines needed, in order to become citizens, to give up all their kinship customs and their beliefs and rights, or that local groups must no longer think of themselves as closely knit communities. Elkin felt that although scattered in groups across Australia and increasing in numbers, the Aborigines will have their own sense and experience of solidarity, of possessing a common history, in short, of being a people. For Elkin, the persistence of distinctive cultural identity was no real barrier to a shared national identity. This argument has never been properly settled, and in many respects it continues to this day. By the 1970s, the policy emphasis on Aboriginal self-determination and small moves towards recognising Aboriginal land rights was more supportive of this concept of distinctive cultural identity within the Australian national identity. By the 1990s, control of land had become a key issue which unfolded in a number of high-profile court cases, the Mabo and Wick High Court decisions in particular, and related legislation such as the Native Title Act. Related to that development, there was a backlash from the 1990s onwards, with politicians like Prime Minister John Howard clearly returning to Hasluck's conception of the place of Aboriginality within Australian identity. The opposition between the two positions continues today, with the debate around the possible revision of the Australian Constitution, in particular whether it's sufficient to acknowledge the original Aboriginal presence on the continent prior to European settlement, or whether Indigenous Australians should have distinctive legal and political rights. In summary, national identity in settler-colonial societies has a distinctive character because they're composed of a combination of Indigenous populations and successive waves of migrant populations. Second, models of integration are divided between a concept of citizenship defined in terms of purely individual rights and one organised around the idea that individual rights can only be properly realised in the context of a recognition of collective rights. Third, the removal of Aboriginal children from their families, the stolen generations, was the official response to children born of mixed Indigenous and non-Indigenous parentage, which was treated as a problem. Fourth, the opposition between the concepts and policies of assimilation and integration can usefully be captured through the difference of opinion between Hasluck and Elkin. Hasluck believed all Aborigines were destined to become almost identical to white Australians, whereas Elkin believed it was possible for Aborigines to retain a distinctive cultural identity.